I wanted to thank everyone for coming, and before we started, I just want to take this time to acknowledge the country that I am coming to you from Yugambeh country. I know that we are all from different parts of Australia right now, but before we get started, I just want to acknowledge the country and the original custodians of the land on which we all live, work and meet. We acknowledge the ancestors and elders, past and present and emerging, and recognise the contribution to culture and the knowledge of Southern Cross University made by Aboriginal people. I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and that inside and outside the buildings of the university always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you everyone for coming, and a great big thank you to my amazing panelists here. These are all some really fascinating women who are using interviews in their research. So I'd like to get started straight away. What we're going to do first is we're going to go around to each of the panelists, and I'll give them just a few minutes to introduce themselves, and then we will get started answering some of your questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box down the bottom, and we'll have a really interesting discussion. So first up, I'm just going to go around in order on my screen here. We'll go to Jane Mosco. If you'd like to just introduce yourself briefly right now.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so my name's Jane, and I've been completing my data collection, and I've just finished it, so I'm at the moment just bringing it all together. So my research is looking at well-being for students who self-identify as learning differently with reading and spelling in high school. And so I'm collecting information from students and teachers. So about 23 teachers and about 22 students from about 8 different schools. And I've used a visual mapping tool alongside as part of the interviews or focus groups. I'm really looking at my interviews with the students as a focus group of one, because it's more of a workshop, and they're engaging with a visual mapping tool, which is a bit like a big felt, a big fuzzy felt, which is like a mind mapping the answers to the questions. And so it's semi-structured, and doesn't always go in a linear format, although there is a structure to it. I guess really importantly for me was to record them using an audio recorder as well as photographing the responses. And I think one of the things that I'm pretty used to doing interviews, so that's sort of an area of strength for me. But what I needed to work on for collecting this data was a really structured way that I had a really similar way of capturing the context, writing field reports, recording it in a really structured way, because I'd be so engaged with the students I'd forget to press play, and different machines work different ways. So I'd started using one machine and it needed to be double pressed to record, and of course a few times another one only needed single pressing. So I had a few little issues along the way, and I used double recorders every time. Once my battery ran out and I had to didn't have a spare battery, I used my iPhone. Someone called me in the middle of the interview, and of course it stopped recording. I didn't know that happened because I hadn't put it onto airplane mode. So there's all little things that I've learned along the way. I'm happy to share with people because it can be quite overwhelming. You think you know what you're doing, and then you need this structure to be really strong and robust so that you can follow it each time and make sure you're capturing all the information that you want to capture. The interview for me was the easy part, the recording, the storage of it straight away, the writing up straight away of the field report. All that was the thing that I had to really work on. And I went to a focus group workshop prior to that, and that was so helpful at helping me set out that structure and feel much more confident in storing my material so I didn't lose stuff. So that's my overview.
Thanks so much, Jane. That was great. Meaghan Lee.
Hi everybody, I'm Meaghan. I'm from the School of Health and Human Sciences. My PhD topic that I'm working on at the moment is dietary patterns and depression. So I'm looking at how healthy dietary pattern is protective against depression symptoms and how an unhealthy dietary pattern may be contributing to depression symptoms. And I conducted 9 focus groups in winter of last year. So around about this time last year, I was doing them between July and September with 50 participants. So quite a large number for a qualitative project. And I just was exploring people's individual and shared experiences with food and mood. I got some really amazing data out of that. I think that one of the things that I found that really helped me was using the Otter program, which was a transcription program. I tend to not be great at typing quite quickly, or I can't look at the screen and type at the same time, so I have to look at the keyboard. So my transcribing at the beginning, before I found the Otter program, was very slow. It was taking me about 4 hours to do 15 minutes of transcription from the audio, and I had 11 and a half hours of focus groups to transcribe. So I'll talk about the Otter program later and about benefits that I found. What else? I also did online focus groups for people who were unable to attend the face-to-face meetings that we did. So I have an experience in both face-to-face focus group structure and the online structure. And to be honest, the online one actually worked better than the face-to-face when it came to people divulging information. So, which I thought would be the other way around, but it didn't end up being like that. Yeah, so that's me.
Excellent. Thank you, Meaghan. I'm sure there's a few points there that we'll come back to later on. Meaghan Vosz, if you'd like to share briefly about your work.
Thanks, Katie, and thank you everyone who's here, and Jane and Meaghan particularly, to hear more about your research. So my research is exploring the practices associated with giving due weight to children and young people's views in policy making. So it's about how policymakers actually take young people's views on board when they're making policy decisions about them. So I worked with 5 young co-researchers with lived experience in out-of-home care, and together we went and did a lot of observing of policymakers and then interviewed them together. And then the second way that I used interview as a method was online interviews of the co-researchers. So in the first phase of research, we found out about policy practices, and in the second phase of research, I worked with the co-researchers to find out what they wanted to change about those practices. So the interviews of policymakers were challenging because policymakers are really used to having all of the power in the room, and part of what made that challenging was about finding spaces and ways to work with the co-researchers about what questions they wanted to ask and how they might be feeling capable to ask them. And then also managing a bit how the policymakers behave towards the young people. And then with the online interviews of the co-researchers, they'd been planned to be focus groups, but once the coronavirus hit, their lives became a lot more chaotic, and so interviews became what we did. And there's some great writing about asynchronous focus groups that I found really useful. So really trying to maintain some form of group communication between these co-researchers that I was interviewing individually online. And what I did was I transferred information between them and shared transcripts and things like that. And now we're just finalising an e-book, which is written by the co-researchers and myself, and it's going to go to policymakers next to get their feedback. That's me.
Gosh, that's fascinating, Meaghan. I'm really interested in quite a few of those things that you brought up there, particularly the asynchronous focus group. That sounds, I wish that I had known about that when I did my focus groups. We'll go to you, Emma, now.
Sure. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everybody. So I'm Emma from the School of Law and Justice. My research project, I suppose, is quite interdisciplinary because I'm studying whether an interpretation of an existing law for work health and safety might be updated in the contemporary age because of people's understandings of well-being. So in order to conduct my research, I'm not confining my research to traditional legal methods, but I'm combining those with experiential studies via a process of active interviews. So specifically the methodology of my interviews is known as active, because the researcher and her participants are necessarily active in co-constructing the stories that are emerging from the dialogue. So the structure of my interviews were semi-structured, adopting quite a themed approach, but also quite fluid in terms of me being able to pick up specific roads that the participants were offering in terms of interpretation. So we might get into that later via some questions. But basically, I interviewed a recruitment criteria of 30 people who consider themselves self-employed persons in small business somewhere within the Northern Rivers. And I've just completed my process of transcription and then entering into the next phase of thematic analysis to work out what to do with that data and overlay it with the legal approach. So it's a combined method, but today we're obviously talking interviews, so look forward to any questions.
Oh, that's great, Emma, and congratulations on that transcription. It is a mammoth task to get that finished. And lastly, but not least, Meaghan Pedler, if you could share a bit about your process.
Thanks, Katie. Hi, everyone. My name's Meaghan. I'm from the School of Education. I'm an associate lecturer in the School of Education, but I'm also completing my PhD. I finished my interviews probably this time last year, so just about a year ago. I'm specifically looking at student engagement and the teacher's role in student engagement in the classroom. So my interviews took place with teachers in schools and they followed on from observations. So I'd observe the teachers teaching 1 or 2 lessons and then the semi-structured interviews took place afterwards. Because there was more than one phase in my interview, and I've heard some of the other panelists say the same thing, the interviews took place in the second phase of my data collection. So the first phase was mainly quantitative and involved a questionnaire, and the findings from that questionnaire influenced what I was looking for in the second phase. And I was looking to find answers in the interviews to explain the things that had come up in that first phase. So as we go through this, I've got my pro forma that I used. I can show you the questions that were influenced by those first phase results, and also incorporating questions, because I just interviewed teachers just before we spoke. I also had some prepared semi-structured questions that were based around the observation that I just completed as well. So all of that took place within those interviews. I actually got funding to transcribe my interviews. I think the school was very generous to do that, and I hugely appreciate it because like Meaghan Lee was saying, it was taking me a really long time. I'd done it in earlier phases of my research for my pilot study and some pre-interviews I'd done before I kind of started my PhD, and a whole day to transcribe 2 20-minute interviews. So I knew that that wasn't going to be an effective use of my time. So I've got the transcriptions, they're all done, they're coded, and I'm using in vivo. The analysis of all that qualitative data is the next thing that's taking place in my PhD. So I'll leave it there for now, but like I said, I've got performers that I can show and I can talk through the actual processes, but that depends on what the attendees are interested in today.
That's great. Thanks so much, Meaghan. We have yet to have any questions in the Q&A box, but I can see that one of the first questions put in the chat is about the transcribing. So I think it's probably a really great place that we might move to discuss the Meaghan Lee with your Otter program. I've got a question here that just asks if it's expensive to access. So we might go straight for that, but we might put it out to all of the panelists to talk about your transcribing process and how you chose to go about it and why now. But we'll start with you, Meaghan, if that's all right.
Yeah,
Meaghan
sure.
Lee.
When I first started my transcribing, and I was really very slow, like I said before, I talked to another PhD student who had done interviews, and she suggested the Otter program, and I didn't have funding for my transcription, and I didn't want to spend money because I'm a poor PhD student. And I asked her how much the Otter program would cost. It's actually free. So the Otter program is an artificial intelligence transcription software that is online based. So it's on an internet platform. It's not a software that you download onto your computer. Keeping in mind that when we do upload our interviews into Otter, it's very important to very quickly de-identify any place names, people names, because it is on the internet and it's not in a secure place. So as soon as you upload, that's something that you need to make sure happens. Basically how it works is you get your MP3 or your MP4 or your audio and you upload it onto this internet site, and like magic it just brings all the little words down and it tells you, it does voice recognition, so it knows each person's voice as person number 1, person number 2, and facilitator. So you can rename those people their pseudonyms, and the software automatically knows when they are speaking, so that helps out really well. When you do it though, because it's artificial intelligence, it doesn't always pick up words correctly, so you still have to go through line by line, word by word, sentence by sentence through the transcript, and you listen to it because you press play and listen to it, and each word, as the audio says it into your headphones, it highlights the word, and you have to make sure that every word is the same as what is in the audio recording. So what I found there was that I didn't want to miss out on that step of data familiarization that you do when you're transcribing, because I really wanted to be deep in my data and I didn't want to miss out on that step. So I found that going through that and making sure that the artificial intelligence was doing the correct thing, and you have to correct its grammar and its spelling as well. So you're still transcribing in a way, but it's just a lot quicker. Yeah, it was taking me about half an hour to do a 15-minute piece of audio, whereas it was taking me 4 hours to write it by hand. Yeah, so that's how the Otter program works, completely free online. I did end up subscribing to an Otter like subscription software to the software package, because I think I'll use it in other parts of my career, and it's only $14 a month to keep it, and then all your data gets stored in there. But as soon as you finish tidying up the transcript, you can automatically put that into NVivo or onto your computer, and it doesn't have to stay on the internet at all, which is probably the best thing to do for security.
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to comment about transcription? Or
Will, I think the important thing is, before you start anything, is to discuss it with your supervisor, because different supervisors seem to have very different approaches to transcription. So one of my supervisors was very clear that because I was interviewing children, I needed to do those interviews and to learn the skills of transcription, and it wasn't even considered a possibility for me to do it in any other way than listening and typing. But once I'd completed all my phase 1, which were the student ones, and I was behind schedule due to some family issues and COVID and the whole thing, then it was suggested that I could, if I needed to get some assistance with the adult ones. And again, as Meaghan said, it's really important to go through it and listen and adjust and make sure that it's been done accurately, and also to really embed yourself in that experience of the data. Yeah. So I thought that was quite interesting, because everyone seems to, when I've spoken to other PhD students, people's supervisors have a different approach to it. So always go there first. And even then, I have been trying now to try and upload my adult interviews to a transcription service, because I do have a little bit of money to help me with that. And I'm having great troubles just getting the transcription service to acknowledge and quote. And so it's not, it just takes time, even doing that. It sounds all magical, but it's not as magical in the reality, because you have to upload and you have to wait for things to happen. And then I was trying to do it through NVivo, and for some reason it wouldn't acknowledge my account that I'd set up. So it's really time consuming sorting out the transcription, whichever way you do it.
Meaghan Pedler, I see you've got your hands up.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. If anyone is lucky enough to have some funding for transcription, it's not cheap. I think I ended up probably with about 11 hours worth of interviews, and it cost me over $900. I did foot the bill for a portion of that. I had a certain amount that came, I was lucky enough to have funded through the school. I agree totally with what Jane said. Go to your supervisors first. In my case, one supervisor wanted me to sit down and type it and go through that process. The other one acknowledged that my time could be more valuably spent elsewhere, considering that I didn't have the skills to do it efficiently. The only thing I would say for those of you that would be investigating that is to make sure that you are getting it transcribed in the format that you're going to use it for. So you can request that it is transcribed in a basic version for NVivo. And then that way it does all the headings for you and formatting for you. And there's different levels that you can ask for and different formats that you can ask for. So just know what you're going to use your data for, what software you're going to use it in for analysis before you look at that option as well.
Meaghan Vosz, but then we'll get Meaghan Lee to answer the question about ethics to do with Otter, but we'll go to Meaghan Vosz first.
I did a mix of both. So I did quite a lot of transcription myself and had a little bit of help. The interviews with policymakers involved myself and at least one co-researcher, sometimes two, one policymaker, but sometimes 4 or 5 other people in the room. So it just wasn't viable to get a transcription service to do that. And they were really incredibly rich conversations that I'm grateful for. The other thing I'd really encourage students to do, whether you use Otter or do it yourself or a transcription service, so you can get CloudStore on your phone as an app, which is CloudStore is where you can store your interview data safely in the cloud. And I used to walk around town listening to the interviews back on my phone, stored safely in CloudStore. And it was it was an awesome way to just familiarise myself with the site, all the work that we did in each site.
That's a fantastic idea. I used to do it while I was painting with mine, as I would be painting and I'd listen to my interviews that way. Meaghan Lee, ethics and using Otter, is there any issues there?
Nope. Ethics didn't come back with any problems.
Did you have to say how you would it's been a long time since I've done my ethics. Do you have to say how you'll transcribe it in your ethics application?
No, we just said that we were going to transcribe verbatim and that was all that we said. Yeah. So, yeah, the use of the Otter program happened after ethics, actually. So we didn't even know at the time that we did ethics that we were going to use it. Now thinking about it, maybe we should tell ethics. I don't know. I haven't thought about that. Thank you for bringing that up.
It's an interesting question. Meaghan Pedler, paying for transcription service, is that something you need to mention in your ethics? Do you?
No, you don't need to mention that it's being paid for, just that it will be transcribed. I'm trying to think what I wrote in my own transcription. There's an amount of privacy that goes with confidentiality that goes with using those services, whereas it would be a bit different if you're uploading it to an insecure place on the internet. So it would be something I'd investigate, especially if you've got sensitive information or information from vulnerable participants. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. I think if you've got vulnerable participants, like that might be another issue in terms of uploading it onto the internet. But it's always good to check with your supervisor and get the go ahead, whatever you choose. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the key point, is to run it by your supervisors and go from there.
There's a question in the Zoom webinar chat, and I'm wondering if you can see that, Katie.
I can. Let's go to it now, shall we? Roweda's asked here, how did you go about getting participants for your survey and interviews? And how did you determine how many participants you needed for a viable study? And so this is 3 questions. Did you give them anything in exchange for participating? So does anyone want to field that question first, or one of those questions?
Oh,
Emma, you go.
Everyone's keen. Let's go Emma first, and then we'll move on from there.
All right, look, I just wanted to say, seek out a number from the literature. So in my literature review, I found 4 similar empirical studies. So what I ended up doing was finding the minimum number of participants in those studies and the maximum. And then I also averaged them out, and I came up with the magic number of 30. So I would just make sure that whatever you're doing is based in the literature and is also given a rationale for your sample size. And in terms of recruitment, don't be afraid to utilise the university in terms of all staff and all student emails. For me, that was an incredibly rich source of recruitment. And in addition to that, as I put in my ethics application, to utilise sources that you already know and networks of those people. So just be really transparent, but I was incredibly grateful for how quickly I fulfilled my recruitment criteria and how many participants I had. I thought that was going to be one of the biggest hurdles, but really it wasn't. And people who see an engaging study and you're conveying that in the recruitment message will be naturally attracted to your study if they fit that criteria. So let your research speak for itself, and don't stress, just get it out there. And I didn't give my participants anything in exchange for interviewing. It was simply understood to be quite an ethical procedure, and there was no sort of reward in that respect.
Do you want me to go next, Cody?
Sure.
I had quite a different experience to that. When I was trying to find out I kept asking my supervisors, so how many people do I need in my, and they think, oh, Jane, you know, it's not about numbers, it's about data saturation. And when you have completed you will know when you've reached saturation, when there's no new information coming. So that felt very wobbly for me for a while. I was like, how will I know when I've reached data saturation? But it does become apparent. And so, yes, mine was not based on a number, but based on what was coming in the data collection. The second, for me, recruitment was a really extensive process, huge, because I was working with young people in schools. And so I couldn't use any existing networks that I had. I had to start from scratch. 2, I had to build up relationships with schools, 8 schools, before they agreed to participate as a school. Once I got them to agree to participate as a school, I then needed to have a champion in that school to liaise with, because schools are really busy places. So once I got that, then I needed to create a video to show the students in an assembly or a year meeting or whatever the school allowed me to do, which was different in every school. And once they had watched the video, then they could elect to take a package. A package had all the information and all the forms, and the forms had to come back. So it was a very long process. And my champion was the person who chased up that elusive package that went home into students' bags. And as you know, once things go into a student's bag, it never usually comes back again. So that whole process took months and months just to get my groups. And I wondered if it would ever actually happen. But so relationship building was really central to that process, and revisiting the schools maybe 3 or 4 times before I actually met a student to work with individually and to interview. So depending on who you are recruiting, and also I had to make a video, and I've never made a video before, and give a talk and do all sorts of things just to, you know, to have that happen. And then of course, you know, some students wanted to participate, but they hadn't got a form returned from their, you know, signed by the parents for whatever reason. And then ethically, we couldn't allow them not to participate just because they didn't have a form, but ethically we couldn't allow them to participate if they didn't have a form. So we had to have all these other structures in place whereby the teacher would ring the family and get permission to fill in the form. And it was complex. really complex. But it's really important to do that ethically and respectfully, and to follow all the processes. And the ethics application, as you can imagine, was a really extensive, I mean, that took me 18 months to achieve my ethics process.
Now, Jane, are you part-time? Is that?
I am part-time, but I was full-time at the beginning, and it didn't make any
full-time.
difference. That's how long it took. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
Can I just make a quick comment about what Emma was saying about the staff and student emails? I also utilised that, and it was, like you said, amazing. I got 83 participants who were interested, and that went down to 50 who actually participated. But doing that actually served as a limitation for my study, because I want to ask people about food and mood and healthy and unhealthy dietary patterns, and the type of participants that I got from that staff and student email recruitment were all well educated, because they were either at uni or teaching uni. They were everybody was health conscious in some way or another, and most of them were following some form of healthy dietary pattern to begin with. So I kind of shot myself in the foot a little bit, that I got this really limited amount of, I got great information and real rich information from people who were health conscious, but I didn't really tap into those types of people who eat the traditional Western dietary pattern, you know, the white bread type plumber down the street, who I didn't get any of their voices in my data. And that's a massive limitation of my project, I believe. And so and that wasn't something that I even considered until after the data was collected, it was transcribed. I'm like, hang on a second, these are all very well educated voices that I'm listening to who know a lot about health and eating and mood. So yeah, just have a think about your research question that you want answered, and think about, when you're recruiting, how to get those other voices, keeping in mind that I could then do the focus groups again and try and access those people. But yeah, that's something that I wish I had known way back then.
That's a really interesting point, Meaghan. I think Meaghan Pedler had her hand up before. Did you want to talk to this?
Sure.
Or was it both Meaghans?
Both three Meaghans here. It's going to make it challenging. So I said before there was 2 phases to my main data collection. So I actually used phase 1 to recruit for phase 2. So because I was working with teachers, I did have a specific group that I wanted. They are an exceptionally challenging group to pin down. So when that online questionnaire went out at the end, there was a section where they could indicate if they were interested in finding out about the next part of the study, if they were interested in being involved. There's a lot that goes with ethics with doing that, because you need to, generally the survey is anonymous and it needs to stay de-identified. But if someone's providing information at the end of a questionnaire, it suddenly becomes identified. So that involved creating another survey that was linked from the end of the survey, so that data was stored separately. So information data or their contact details were stored separately from their responses. So all of their responses stayed anonymous, but I had a contact list for stage 2. So that's one way of going around it, and you need to be very clear in ethics about it, and you will get pushback from ethics if any stage of that recruitment process means that the data you're collecting is no longer anonymous. So think about how to do that. And if anyone has specific questions, I'm happy to answer exactly how I did that. I did that in Qualtrics, and it was really simple and straightforward. As far as determining how many participants I needed, Emma's study with 30 participants for qualitative data is huge in my field, in education. That's absolutely enormous. And if I had have said that number to my supervisors, they would have just laughed at me and said, get real. So basically in my field, and it's about you knowing your own field, and as Emma said, looking at the literature and seeing what's relevant, and looking at the literature, specifically looking at the literature around with the qualitative studies that have been done on teachers' perceptions, most of those only had 4 to 8 participants. And in other qualitative aspects I've been looking at in student engagement, sort of, I got, in my mind, I wanted somewhere between probably 8 and 15. And I thought that would be a lot of data. Turns out it was a huge amount of data. I'm terrified at the prospect of having to sit down and analyse it at the end of this year. But it's definitely more than enough. I believe I ended up with 9 interviews. And that's more than enough for what I'm doing. 4 or 5 probably would have been enough as well, but it does depend on your field. But Emma gave really good advice about starting with the literature to establish that. And like Jane said, checking with your supervisors as well to kind of confirm that and get some guidance. I didn't give them anything for being involved. There'll be some kind of intrinsic motivation. You've got to hope for your participants to be involved. Some fields do provide incentives. It's a $50 voucher, or it's this, or it's a lunch, or whatever it is. In education, we don't really do that. In my case, the teachers that were involved in observations and interviews, they did tend to be in management. They did tend to be more senior, or they did tend to be a teacher who was looking towards promotion or moving up in their career, and being involved in research is one of the things that they need to have evidence of. So there's kind of that ulterior motive for participation. So in one way, like Meaghan had said, it does limit the pool. I didn't get any first year teachers. I would have loved first and second year teachers and watch them teach and interview them about it. But I did get kind of a certain demographic, but they came from all sorts of different schools, all sorts of different school sizes. So it was okay, but you won't always get everyone that you want to participate, or the variety of participants that you want. Yeah, I'll pass over to you, Meaghan.
Thank you, Meaghan. It's wonderful hearing the different research strategies that we've all used. So in my research, actually recruiting young people in out-of-home care was the easier part of the recruitment, believe it or not, because I faced the same challenges as Jane naturally in terms of them being young people and them being a vulnerable group. I also had a requirement to at least include some Aboriginal young people, given their overrepresentation in out-of-home care. So there was some tricky things there, but and I also couldn't go to young people that I'd worked with before. What was actually much more challenging was gaining external approvals. So with 6 organisations we did policy observation and interviews with, which involved, site visits and all kinds of stuff. But 5 of those were government departments that had different kinds of ethics committees and approvals processes. One of those took 11 months. One of them just happened on the phone. So they were extremely complex external processes. So if you want to get involved with the Department of Communities and Justice, or Department of Health, or Department of Education, Youth Justice, they all have different approvals processes, and you need to find out about them. And for some of those organisations, that process is not published online. But for some organisations it is. So Department of Youth Justice in New South Wales, the whole process is online. It was extremely transparent, but it was the one that took the longest, because in the middle there I had to get approval from the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council as well, which took quite a long time. So yeah, just really wanted to draw your attention to the fact that if you're going to those departments as well, there's another round of approval. I can see you commiserating, Jane.
Well, I'll just say that in the education system, it's not dissimilar. So you need to get your university ethics application. Then you need to go to the Department of Education. And then if you're using the Catholic Ed, you need to go to the Catholic Ed. And then independent schools that aren't part of those, you then have to go individually to each school principal to get, yeah, it's a long process.
And with children and young people, certainly young people who are in out-of-home care or leaving out-of-home care, that their fairly common experience of poverty means that there's, I guess, a bit of extra weight to incentivising their participation, and rather than seeing it as an incentive, seeing it instead as a compensation for their time and their lived experience. So I certainly paid the young people with vouchers, unfortunately, rather than cash, but that was what was the best thing. And every time I worked with them. So if I do another round of interviews with them, there'll be another round of vouchers going out to them.
And I think that does also, as Meaghan Pedler was saying, it's different in each department. Like, there was no question that I was definitely not allowed to offer any incentives or offer anything. I think after the event later on, maybe a certificate, but I don't even think that, actually. It's quite interesting that the ethical issues in working with young people are different depending on the context. And again, it's really based on your supervisors and how they understand the context and what seemed as appropriate.
I've just put a link there to the child ethics global kind of compendium of online research and ethics kind of papers that you can find, that's actually managed by the Centre for Children and Young People here at SCU. They have some great papers on some of these issues, like payment and compensation of children and young people as researchers and as research participants.
And further to that, just I know that I understood from looking at all that child ethics information that the young people have to be deemed to benefit somehow from being part of the process. It's not good enough just to ask questions of young people. It's about what are the young people going to get from that experience? How are they going to benefit somehow? And can that information be better found elsewhere without having to utilize their time? Because I was taking them out of class to so they're missing education, so they need to benefit from something, and also that's dependent on the time frame that I was allowed to get them out of class for, because their education is deemed to be more important than my research. So obviously the principal has to feel like those young people would benefit from participating, and they'll get something that was as valuable as their lesson. So I think that's really important to consider. And with the Department of Education, again, they needed to feel secure that I had the skills to interview young people, and that I understood the ethics involved, and I was going to be suitable because I was coming into their space where their head of agency was responsible for the young people. And so that person had to feel that I was confident that I was going to be able to do a respectful job of being with those young people, and thus needing to make sure that I had I had working with children check, blah blah blah, all the other things as well in place.
It's really interesting information. Ethics is such a huge part of our interview process, isn't it? I'm aware that we've only got about 10 minutes left of our time together, and one of the questions that we got asked when people registered for this chat was around the idea of the differences between in-person interviews and online interviews, particularly in our context right now. For people moving forward, there'll be a lot more, I'm assuming, Zoom interviews and various not face-to-face interviews. Did anyone want to comment on their thoughts around that? Meaghan, we'll go Meaghan Pedler first, then Meaghan Vosz, and then anyone else who wants to jump in.
Thanks, Katie. My intention has been to conduct all of my interviews in person, because I intended to observe the teachers teach first and then conduct interviews. I had noticed that there's a number of questions around costs and funding that are coming up in the chat, because that's a big one for us as HDR candidates. Can I just, before I answer that question, there's grants out there, there's HDR grants out there. I got a $1,500 grant from University of Macquarie. They do HDR, they do an annual HDR one there. keep your eye out, because that actually funded my travel and data collection for my interviews. And it also contributed to the transcription. As I said, the school didn't cover the whole fee for transcription. It also contributed to the transcription. It covered, I needed to stay overnight because I had to travel a distance for my interviews as well. So we're lucky in the School of Education that we do get a certain amount of funding, but there's definitely a limit on that. So investigate HDR grants where you can and apply. They're generally quite generous, and there's not always very many applicants. I know that sounds strange, but depending on your field, there's not always very many applicants, and it can be really, really helpful as you're going through. Katie, what was I talking about? Ah, that's right, in person and face to face. So do you mind if I quickly share my screen actually? So I said before I conducted semi-structured interviews. Now, and I heard some other panelists speak about this, so they'll be able to speak about their experience with this. But a semi-structured interview means that you go in with specific questions, and it means that there's some continuity or standardization between your interviews. You can have a fully structured interview, or you can have an unstructured interview as well. You can do your reading on it and work out what suits. For me, because I was investigating what I found out in phase 1, I used semi-structured interviews. Now, having my interview questions, having my interview questions clearly typed out, and then possible extension questions, and that's what makes it semi-structured, the fact that you can go off on a tangent if you need to, meant that my face-to-face and my online interviews were consistent, and I was asking them about the same information. So I explored the data that I'd found from phase 1, the online questionnaire. I then asked questions about the observations. For the online interviews, I hadn't just observed them, so I didn't do that. And at the end, there was some specific questions that really drilled down into my actual theory and framework that I was exploring. What I found with the online was, the reason I was interviewing them online is because it was going to cost me too much to get there. So to get to central Queensland and to get to central New South Wales to interview one person in one school, it wasn't viable. Yes, I got some money, but that was to help me to get to South Grafton. It was to help me get North Gold Coast and Brisbane from me here on the Southern Gold Coast. And that's how that helped. So interviewing online, my interviewees that were in those places, the internet wasn't good. The knock-on effect of that is if you are paying for the transcription, it costs more because the quality of your recording won't be as good. It does take away that natural flow that can happen with an interview, but at the same time, in an interview, and you'll read about this when you read about interviews, is you don't want to be too eager, so they think they're saying everything right when they're off on a tangent, but also you don't want to be too flat because you want them to warm to you and speak to you. So I actually found that online a bit easier in that respect, because when I was in person, I was so conscious of how I was sitting and where my hands were, and if I was going too much, and those kind of things. And it comes with practice. It was my first time doing interviews. What a time to learn. But I found having the semi-structured interviews there, those questions pre-prepared, knowing that that's what I was asking at with every person, it helped, and it standardized those questions. If I had a preference, I would prefer to interview people online, teachers specifically, face-to-face, but I think online can be just as effective for those people who've had to make switches to accommodate COVID and other impacts. I think you can get just as rich data online. And I'll pass it over to whoever else has something to comment on there.
I mean, the only reason I think that I didn't need to do it online, but I did travel great distances and stay overnight to interview one person. And one of my considerations why I chose not to do that was because I was using a tabletop resource with the students, and I wanted to use the same with the teachers, and because I was, for lots of different reasons. And so having a focus group or an interview that involves sorting or doing something and looking, and also had some photographs that were a stimulus from the students that they created in an art workshop in phase 2, and that was like a stimulus for the teacher interview. And it was very much more powerful to look at those all at once rather than one by one on a screen or something like that. And so I drove miles and stayed in dingy motels and things like that, all for the joy of my data collection. And I didn't think about finding a grant, Meaghan. That would have been great to know. Spent a lot of money on that, but anyhow, it's worth it.
I went from face-to-face to online interviews as well. And definitely there were some aspects of the face-to-face interviews that I don't think we could have replicated online, like policymakers all having yarns together about whatever they're working on and us observing and then interviewing one of them. I think that would have been incredibly complex online, but working with the young people online to interview them and then design a book together and then go back to them about what changes they wanted, that was interestingly okay. And one of the things that they've said to me is that often when we're in a group or even when we're face to face, and maybe this has got a bit to do with trauma background as well, they might feel a bit on the spot and maybe a little bit anxious about participating and responding to questions, whereas in their own home, in their own dining room or in their own bedroom or something, it's just their space. So even though I'm online with them, and so there's that disconnection, there's actually a certain kind of safety with it. And so yeah, so that was an interesting thing that a couple of them have said to me. I'm just putting the name of the paper that I was reading about asynchronous focus groups into the chat box.
And I think just to follow on from what Meaghan was saying there, for my pilot, one of the young people who wanted to participate as a youth advisor travelled a long way to come, and there was a couple of meetings. And so the first one, she came in person to sort of get to know the others. And then because she wanted to remain involved, but was unable to get there without leaving school early, which was a bit of a no-no for the ethics part. So what we actually ended up doing was that she would dial in on some sort of technology into the focus group, and we actually had you know, a seat with the computer on so that she could actually participate in the focus group. And because she'd met everyone the first time and felt confident at the process and what was going to happen, it actually worked fine for her to participate. And we just had a much more structured approach to, let's go around in a circle so everybody can, so we could just move it around and not have to try and follow the conversation in a more ad hoc way. We just became more structured about doing more of a circle time approach, whereby everyone had their time and slot to have their say. And that worked really well. And it enabled the young person to participate when they were, you know, further away regionally and weren't able to get there.
I can just see that we've got a comment in the chat feed here about needing to conduct phone interviews with parents during early parenting. Is there any advice about conducting a phone interview?
Can I ask why it has to be a phone and why it can't be a Zoom or something similar where you can see the person's face? Whoever asked the question. A phone interview is what you read about in the older research texts.
I've conducted a phone interview.
Oh, well, you tell us about it, Katie.
Oh, I just in my honours year, and it was a while ago now. Gosh, I don't really have any comments about it, except that I wish that I did it on Zoom, because it would have been great to get, you do miss so much in not seeing facial expressions, and it's very difficult to establish a rapport, and also quite difficult to record. A phone, like I found it very difficult to transcribe because I don't know whether there's better technology to record. I think I had like and this is my honours year and I was very inexperienced. I had like a voice recorder up against the phone, and transcribing it was very echoey. So my suggestion, and I can't see here whether, is it Sharon that asked the question about the phone, whether there's a possibility to do it on Zoom. I think it's a wonderful medium to record at least, and to gather all of that non-verbal information that you manage to get with your transcriptions.
Could I just make a point there? I did both face-to-face and online focus groups. So there were groups of 5 to 6 participants at a time. And when I did the face-to-face groups, I recorded, just like Jane was saying, I double recorded. I did it on my iPhone and I did it on a voice recorder, a proper transcription one. And it was really difficult to know which person was saying what. Even using the Otter program, it was like that person's talking and that person's talking. It was hard to discern the difference. But when you do it on Zoom, the recording is much clearer. People tend to not talk over each other in a Zoom situation, rather than face-to-face. There was a lot of dialogue where 3 or 4 people were all talking at once, which is really hard to figure out in the transcription. Otter would be like, what's happening? So yeah, for some reason we don't tend to like talk over each other in Zoom, which is a really good thing. And you can record it, and even if you forget to press stop record, it still goes to the cloud anyway. I had a big scare on my first online Zoom one because I didn't stop record and I thought I'd lost it. But yeah, so just a really much better way of being able to listen to each person's voice, I think, especially in group setting.
Quick point about that it will impact your ethics. You need to, there's a difference between video and audio and identifying that in ethics. And I know for young people, it was definitely seen as more invasive to video, and particularly because they are very aware of how they appear on video. Yeah. Whereas audio was much less. And I noticed in the point that somebody was talking about, you know, where there isn't a great, if you're interviewing what was it, regional parents,
bandwidth. It's a real issue being able, I mean, haven't we all experienced it as our connection issues with Zoom, and I think the phone is probably what you have to do.
There is an option on Zoom to record audio only, and I use that. I didn't want to video record my participants for those reasons, so I audio recorded only, and it was just as good.
But that's assuming that the people who you're interviewing can function with Zoom and something like that, and that's why I think might have been a question about that. And I think really at the end of the day we have to look at what is our research question, who are we trying to engage, and we have to use whatever is the most appropriate with that group.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, and meet them where they're at too. It's like, just because our technology is one way, if our participants aren't able to meet that, then we're not really being very ethical in our
just because it's easier for us to transcribe with certain things doesn't mean that that's the way we should go.
Maybe the only point that I put around that in the chat is that you just need to consider, no matter what format you use, where you're doing it, how are you going to get the highest quality recording that you can? I think Jane or someone else Meaghan just said about recording on 2 devices. I had 2 of the little MP, what are they called, Katie? Because I borrowed yours, the little voice recorder things.
MP3. I don't remember what they're called.
I can't remember the little voice recorders anyway. I had 2.
Jane has them right now, I think.
I do. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. We're passing them around. So, but this idea of having 2 recordings, definitely. When I did my online ones with Zoom, I recorded in Zoom, and I also was recording it on my desk as well. Because if one of those goes down, like Jane said, if she got a phone call in the middle and her phone stopped recording, and all of a sudden you're missing half an interview and you go off and don't look at it for a week, which you might think isn't going to happen, but it will. So just think about how can you have multiple devices recording, and how will you get the highest recording possible. So if you are just using a phone and having to call someone, does that mean you've got your phone on speaker and a recording device next to it that's recording it at the same time? Do a test run, see what the quality is, see if it's affected by where you are or anything like that. Just make sure you're ready, because there's nothing worse getting a really dodgy recording and having bad audio that you're trying to transcribe can be really challenging.
And on the top of that,
Maya has said here, sorry Jane, Maya has said in the chat to put your iPhone on airplane mode.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great idea.
And what I did with those 2 recorders is I put them at different bits of the table where there were more than, because some people have very quiet voices, and some students, if they had very quiet voices, I would surreptitiously move the recorder more to them, so that at least I had one recorder that was capturing their very quiet voice. Because when you are listening back, you've got it on a set volume, and some people are very loud and some people are very quiet. It's quite difficult. Whereas if you've got a second recording that is capturing the quiet people a little more effectively, like on one side of the table, sometimes I would go to the second recording to try and hear, to see who said that and what was said. Yeah.
I'm going to just pause everyone for just a moment. We're 5 minutes over time, and I wanted to thank everyone who has come and listened. Thank you so much for coming. I know it's a really weird environment where we can't see all of your faces. I'm happy to keep talking for another few minutes. I'm not sure about the panelists, but I have popped in the chat a feedback form for all of the people who have attended. It would be really helpful to, I've lost, it's up in the top of the chat. We've been talking a bit. I'll pop it in there again because feedback's really helpful for us at the SCPA, so that we can provide things for you that really meet your needs. I'm just popping it in here again, sorry. And the one thing that we haven't answered, if we've still got a few minutes to answer it, is one of the questions was, how did you develop your questions? And that's been asked quite a few times. So did anyone want to just grab onto that one? Meaghan Vosz first.
Others will talk about other reasons and literature and theoretical frameworks, but one of the things that was the most challenging in my interviews was working with the young people around what questions they wanted to ask. So if you've grown up in out-of-home care, you've got a lived experience of being inside that policy. And so it was quite important to have an established relationship with the young people that was, yes, obviously about our relationship, but also a relationship where we had gotten used to talking about policy and talking about how policy shows up in their lives, so that after we'd done our observations, we could, in a private space, have a conversation, and they might feel comfortable enough to tell me the questions they wanted me to ask, or to brainstorm a question they wanted to ask. And so that kind of critical, reflexive conversation with the young people as co-research was absolutely vital to working out what questions. Yeah.
Emma, you're on mute.
Yes, I just wanted to share that this was a really interesting process for me, because the approach to my interview guide, as I called it, based on the literature, was quite thematic. So I had a list of key themes in a certain structure, but of course, being semi-structured, some interviews took different turns. But I just wanted to say, my themes weren't written out as questions. They were more like trigger points or items for discussion. And for me, that was one of the greatest strengths, I believe, of my interviews looking back, because it allowed me the fluidity to pick up the point the participant had just made and perhaps follow them down that path a little bit and use their language a lot in the question. So depending on your research purpose and your methodology, of course, but I just wanted to share that that could be a really useful way not to get stuck or tripped up on a preconceived idea, but allowing the participant's voice a little bit more with your own questioning.
I'll just speak very briefly. Thanks for that, Emma. I had a similar thing in that I had only just 4 questions. One was like, what do we already know about the situation? One, what supports the situation? What doesn't support the situation? And what would some solutions be? So they were like very wide-ranging questions, that within that we had like mini discussions around each of those questions, and they would create the answers individually, and then place them on the felt where we could discuss them more. And so it sort of, the data revealed itself on the felt, as Katie, you like that phrase, and then we were able to sort of get a color, and each question had a different color leaf, so we could see visually on the leaf, and then the young people then grabbed hold of the responses and put them, they did the first bit of thematic analysis by putting them under the different headings that existed and we also added to. So it gave us a bit more room to maneuver similar.
Meaghan Lee?
Yes, so I was a bit similar to Emma and Jane, where my questions were more very broad and prompts, but I was also like Meaghan Pedler, where my questions kind of came from, I did a systematic review of all the systematic reviews in my field, and it informed the questions that I wanted to ask from in the focus groups. But I found that for the first maybe 1 or 2 of my focus groups, I was really sticking to my questions and making sure that I wanted to get the questions asked. And then when it came to about the 3rd to the 9th focus group, I just relaxed a heap. And most of the time I didn't ask any questions. I would just say, okay, everybody, let's go around and we'll introduce ourselves, say who you are, and why you wanted to be a part of this research. And from there, I got about an hour and a half of them just talking to each other. They never went off topic. They were always talking about food and mood. It was just, people just, yeah, it was really amazing. So I kind of abandoned my questions and my prompts from about the 3rd focus group in.
That's really interesting, Meaghan. I'm really interested to see if anyone in this group had a more structured approach. It seemed, Emma, yours was fairly structured in your questions, or?
Sorry, semi-structured, Katie. So I would say sort of a cyclical structure. Each interview went down, but within that, I would ask the themes sort of out of order depending on what they were already saying. So bit of both.
And Meaghan Pedler, what about you?
I definitely sound like the most structured. So even though mine was semi-structured, because it was the 2nd phase of data collection, I was looking for specific answers. So I definitely wanted teachers' perceptions, I wanted their understandings, but it was on quite specific things. So that was done with a few specific questions that I had. As I showed you before on the shared screen, there was, I had a number of possible follow-up questions just so that I didn't freeze in the moment. So I had some good deep questions prepared if I got a non-talker or if they answered very quickly. But also at each stage, obviously when we're talking about the observations, it was more open. I knew in general what I'd be asking them about. So I often would start with something like, tell me about the class I just saw, tell me about your experiences with the class, that type of thing. And the one of the last activities that we did had these little flashcards that had things on it, and they had to kind of move them around, and we talked about that process and what that meant. And that's when I kind of let them in on the framework I was looking at and saw their kind of interpretation of what they'd done and if they agreed with it and had discussions around that. But from the sounds of it, mine was probably one of the most structured, but having semi-structured interviews at whatever level that is, whether they're real, you know, more on the side of very structured, which it sounds like mine was, to much looser, going in with some questions prepared, I think really, especially if you don't have experience interviewing, which I think was the case for most of us, it's really helpful. It gives you a lot more confidence going in with your participants if they're people you don't know. In my case, I'd met them an hour and a half earlier before I sat in their classroom, and then we were having a chat, and then I said, thank you very much and goodbye.
I think the important thing to get across, because it sounds like it was so loose, but I actually had a really clear sheet, like Meaghan, saying all the information, because there's a lot of information that you need to convey. You need to, you know, reaffirm that it's okay to record. You need to make sure that they understand what the research is about, because it's been a long time since I went in and did the introduction. And so all this information that isn't even the questions. And so I had all that written down to make sure it was the same each time, then I had a very clear structure, but within that clear structure there was a looseness to allow things to come up. And it's interesting because that was my phase one with the students, and when I moved to the teachers, then there was again a very clear structure, because I asked their perspectives about a few questions first, and then only later on did I provide them with the student stimulus, that then they could see the students' responses, and then they responded to that. So it was all very carefully worked out, even though there was a looseness to parts of it. There was very structured, and I had very detailed sheets saying, well, first do this, and then, but that allowed some openness in the process as well, because so to make sure there's consistency amongst focus groups that we could be months apart.
That's really wonderful. Jane, thank you so much for sharing. I am aware that we've gone 15 minutes over time. So I would like to thank each and every one of the panelists for giving their time this afternoon. I think it's been a really informative discussion, and I think we might try and organise something maybe on a slightly different topic like this again, because I think it's really important that as postgrads we all learn from each other, and there's so much a wealth of information out there amongst ourselves. And here at the SCPA, our motto is postgrads helping postgrads to succeed. And I really feel that all of you today have helped the people who have attended here today, and those who will be able to view the recording in the future with some really practical information. So thank you very much. And I hope everyone has a really wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much for organising it all, Katie.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.